To millions of kids in the 1950s, he wasn't just a man. He was a symbol. He was Superman, the invincible hero from another planet who stood for truth, justice, and the American way. George Reeves, with his broad chest and fatherly smile, was the living, breathing man of steel, an icon of strength and moral clarity in post-war America. His show, Adventures of Superman, was a sensation, beaming into homes across the nation and defining the superhero for an entire generation. But behind the cape and the S-shield, a very different, much darker story was unfolding. A story of forbidden romance, Hollywood power games, and vicious jealousy. On June 16, 1959, that illusion of invincibility was shattered. George Reeves was found dead, naked in his bed, from a single gunshot to the head. The world woke up to a headline that seemed impossible: Superman was dead. The official story was written almost before the investigation even started. A tragedy, they said, but a simple one. A classic case of suicide. A depressed actor, typecast and unable to escape the shadow of his cape, had decided to end it all. But for many, that simple story felt like a lie. And for over 60 years, the questions about that night have refused to die, creating one of Hollywood's most enduring and chilling mysteries. To millions, he was Superman, the invincible man of steel. But what if the most terrifying villain George Reeves ever faced wasn't some on-screen mobster, but a possessive lover in his own life? For over 60 years, the death of TV's first Superman has been officially ruled a suicide. But the evidence tells a far more complicated story: a gun with no fingerprints, strange bruises on the body, and a bizarre 45-minute delay before anyone bothered to call the police. Now, a deathbed confession, if you believe it, might just reveal the dark secret a powerful Hollywood fixer, Toni Mannix, took to her grave. The truth, or at least this version of it, is far more sinister than anyone thought. The official narrative of George Reeves's death is tidy. Almost too tidy. The LAPD painted a picture of a man at the end of his rope. The story goes like this: on the night of June 15, 1959, George Reeves and his fiancée, a fiery socialite named Leonore Lemon, got back to his home at 1579 Benedict Canyon Drive. Reeves was tired and went upstairs. Lemon, however, wanted to keep the party going and invited friends over. Sometime after 1 a.m., the noise from downstairs supposedly ticked Reeves off. He came down, exchanged angry words, had a drink, and stormed back to his bedroom. It was then, according to the guests, that Leonore Lemon made a chillingly odd prediction. As Reeves walked up the stairs, she supposedly remarked, "He's probably going to go shoot himself." A noise was heard, like a drawer opening. Lemon continued, "He's opening a drawer to get the gun." Then, a single, muffled pop. "See there," she said. "I told you so." And yet, nobody called the police. Not for 30, not for 40, but for nearly 45 minutes. When the LAPD finally showed up, they found George Reeves, the man of steel, dead. A 9mm Luger pistol lay on the floor between his feet. With eyewitness accounts of a moody Reeves and a fiancée claiming he was despondent over his career, the police quickly closed the book. The coroner's report was swift, and the verdict was clear: suicide. Case closed, but it wasn't. Because from the moment that official story hit the press, it started to unravel. Friends and colleagues refused to believe it. Actor Rory Calhoun famously said, "No one in Hollywood believed the suicide story. They knew George. He was engaged to be married in just a few days. He had a new movie deal in the works and was excited about directing. This wasn't a man about to end his life. This was the beginning of a portrait of a potential crime scene." And every piece of physical evidence seemed to suggest that something was terribly wrong. When you look past the convenient narrative fed to the press, the open and shut suicide case starts to look more like a potential cover-up. The physical evidence wasn't just inconsistent with a suicide, it made it seem highly improbable. Let's break down the scene, piece by piece. First, the weapon. The 9mm Luger that ended Reeves's life was found between his bare feet. Here's red flag number 1, the police found no fingerprints on the gun. 0. Not from Reeves, not from anyone. The official explanation was that the gun was too oily to hold a print. In another version, it was too well dusted. These are convenient explanations, but they don't hold much water. An oiled gun can still hold prints, and the idea that Reeves would meticulously wipe his own weapon clean before shooting himself is illogical. A much more plausible explanation? Someone else wiped it clean. Then there's the gunpowder residue. When you fire a gun, especially close to your head, it leaves a fine deposit of powder. There were no powder burns found on George Reeves's hands or on the wound itself. The absence of this residue strongly suggests the gun was held at a distance inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. It points to someone else in the room. To make matters worse, some sources claim the body was embalmed before the second autopsy was performed, a shocking breach of protocol that could have destroyed any chance of collecting this kind of crucial forensic evidence. And what about the bullet casing? The single spent shell casing from the Luger was found underneath Reeves's body. Anyone familiar with ballistics will tell you this is bizarre. A Luger ejects spent casings upwards and to the right. If Reeves had held the gun to his own temple, the casing should have landed away from him, probably on the floor behind him. For it to end up under his back is hard to explain, though some experts say it's not physically impossible. Still, it suggests the scene might have been manipulated, but perhaps the most glaring clue were the other bullets. Investigators discovered a total of 3 bullet holes in the bedroom. The fatal bullet was recovered from the ceiling. But 2 other bullets were found lodged in the floor, hidden under a rug. When questioned, Leonore Lemon had a flimsy story. She claimed that a few days earlier, she'd been fooling around with the gun and it accidentally went off. Twice. This story is so absurd it's almost insulting. A far more chilling interpretation is that these bullet holes were from a struggle or missed shots during the murder itself. Finally, there was the condition of the body. Reeves's mother, Helen Besselow, never believed her son took his own life. She was so sure of foul play that she hired her own attorney, the famous Jerry Giesler, and demanded a second autopsy. That exam revealed what the first had either missed or ignored. Unexplained bruises on Reeves's head and body, suggesting he might have been in a fight shortly before his death. This wasn't a man who quietly decided to die, this was a man who may have fought for his life. So we have a gun with no prints, a lack of powder burns, a weirdly placed shell casing, 2 extra bullet holes, and a bruised body. Taken together, these inconsistencies don't just whisper foul play, they shout it from the rooftops, challenging the official story at every turn. To understand what might have happened to George Reeves, you have to understand the toxic world he lived in. It was a world of immense power, where secrets were currency. At the center of it all were 3 people locked in a dangerous triangle: George Reeves, the reluctant star; Leonore Lemon, the volatile fiancée; and Toni Mannix, the scorned lover with terrifying connections. George Reeves was a man of contradictions. Publicly, Superman. Privately, deeply frustrated. He was a trained actor from major films like Gone with the Wind, but the Superman role had typecast him into a corner. Still, in 1959, things were looking up. He was prepping to direct a sci-fi film and had a wrestling tour booked in Australia. But his lavish lifestyle wasn't something he could afford on his own. For years, it had been bankrolled by one person, Toni Mannix. Then you have Leonore Lemon, the woman with him on the night he died. A New York socialite with a fiery temper, her presence in his life signaled the end of Reeves's long-term affair, a decision that may have had fatal consequences. Her behavior that night was, to say the least, suspicious. Her bizarre "I told you so" comment and the 45-minute delay in calling the police made her an obvious person of interest. Was she a killer, or just an opportunist caught in the crossfire? Many think she didn't have the power to orchestrate what might have come next. That power, the theory goes, belonged to Toni Mannix. Born Camille Frumis, she reinvented herself as a showgirl named Toni Lanier. She was beautiful, ambitious, and married one of the most feared men in the industry, Eddie Mannix. Eddie Mannix was the vice president and general manager of MGM, but his real title was The Fixer. When a star got into trouble, it was Eddie's job to make it disappear. He had deep, rumored connections to organized crime and operated with impunity, cleaning up messes with intimidation, bribes, and even violence. Toni and Eddie had an open marriage. Eddie had his own affairs, and he tolerated Toni's long-term relationship with George Reeves. It wasn't just an affair, Toni was obsessed. She bought George his house, his car, and his clothes. She essentially owned him. But in late 1958, George did the one thing he wasn't supposed to do. He decided to leave her for Leonore Lemon. For Toni Mannix, this was a profound humiliation. She was devastated, enraged, and according to friends, she began to unravel. Her obsession, once a source of comfort for Reeves, now became a terrifying force aimed right at him. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that the official narrative has more holes than a block of Swiss cheese. The evidence has led many to suspect a cover-up at the highest levels of Hollywood. If you're finding this mystery as fascinating as I am, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more Hollywood true crime dives you won't want to miss. Now, let's get back to the final days of George Reeves, and the woman who wouldn't let him go. With the suicide theory on shaky ground, the investigation logically narrows to one central figure in this murder theory, Toni Mannix. While Leonore Lemon was suspicious, she lacked the pull to orchestrate a massive cover-up. Toni, on the other hand, had everything: a motive, the means, and the connections to erase the crime. The motive was a powerful mix of obsession and humiliation. For nearly a decade, George Reeves had been hers. When he left her for a younger woman, she was furious. This wasn't just a breakup, it was a rebellion from the man she felt she controlled. Her rage wasn't quiet. In the months before his death, Reeves was tormented by a campaign of harassing, silent phone calls. He was so unnerved he confided in friends that he believed Toni was behind it, trying to torture him into coming back. But motive and harassment aren't proof of murder. For that, you need means and opportunity. This is where Toni's marriage to Eddie Mannix becomes the terrifying centerpiece of the theory. Eddie was MGM's fixer, a man who allegedly had the mob on speed dial. The theory isn't that Eddie acted out of jealousy. It's that he may have acted to pacify Toni. Her grief and rage would have become a problem for him. Silencing George Reeves might have been the quickest way to silence Toni's hysteria, a brutal, cold business transaction. The most damning circumstantial evidence comes from two chilling accounts. The first is from Phyllis Coates, who played Lois Lane on Superman. Coates stated that in the very early hours of June 16, around 4:30 a.m., long before the news broke, she got a hysterical phone call from Toni Mannix. Through sobs, Toni allegedly cried, "The boy is dead. He's been murdered." How could she have known he was dead, let alone murdered, hours before the press was notified? It sounds like someone whose plan had just been carried out. Breaking down under the emotional weight of it all, the second piece of the puzzle that has led researchers to the Mannix network is the funeral home where Reeves's body was taken. It was allegedly owned by a close associate of Eddie Mannix. This has been pointed to as a sign of control, ensuring that any evidence contradicting the suicide story would be handled by their network. The famous lawyer George's mother hired, Jerry Giesler, also abruptly quit the case. Rumors swirled that Giesler warned her to drop it, telling her that very bad people were involved and she should let it go for her own safety. Who else could a lawyer of Giesler's stature be afraid of, if not the mob-connected machine of a studio fixer? The case against Toni Mannix is a web of powerful circumstantial evidence. The rage, the power of her husband, the harassing calls, and the alleged methodical control of the aftermath all point in one direction. But the final piece, the one that elevates this from a compelling theory to something more, would only emerge decades later. For decades, the case went cold. Toni Mannix lived out her life in wealth and seclusion. After Eddie died in 1963, she inherited his massive estate and, by all accounts, remained obsessed with George Reeves, turning a room in her home into a shrine for him. She never spoke publicly about his death. But as she approached the end of her life, ravaged by Alzheimer's and reportedly consumed by guilt, that silence may have been broken. The story of the deathbed confession comes from a publicist named Edward Lawsey, who befriended Toni in her later years. According to Lawsey, as Toni lay dying in 1983, she was attended by a Catholic priest for her final confession. Lawsey claims he was there as the ailing woman, supposedly terrified of eternal damnation, finally unburdened her soul. In a frail voice, she confessed her great sin. She told the priest that her husband, Eddie Mannix, had been responsible for George's death. He had taken care of George for her. Why confess after all those years? Lawsey's answer was simple: she was absolutely terrified of going to hell. Naturally, Lawsey's story has faced scrutiny. He didn't go public with it until 1999, and some question his motives. However, his account doesn't exist in a vacuum. For those who never believed the suicide story, it was the capstone that seemed to connect all the dots. It appeared to explain Phyllis Coates's mysterious phone call, the questionable crime scene, and why a top lawyer like Jerry Giesler would drop the case in fear. It was a bombshell allegation. The confession wasn't that Toni pulled the trigger herself. It was something almost more sinister. It was that she used her influence over one of the most dangerous men in Hollywood to have her lover murdered simply because he dared to leave her. It was a crime born of obsession, executed by proxy, and covered up by the immense power of the studio system. The story of George Reeves's death is more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a tragedy that exposes the brutal hypocrisy that festered under Hollywood's glamorous surface. On screen, George Reeves was the man of steel. In reality, he may have been the victim of a system so corrupt it could allegedly murder one of its own and write it off as suicide. The official verdict has been plagued by questions from the start. The gun wiped clean, the lack of powder burns, the bruises, the extra bullets, all of it points to a violent, chaotic scene that doesn't neatly align with the story of a man taking his own life. While other suspects have been floated, the theory pointing to Toni Mannix is the one that has endured. Her obsessive love curdling into rage, combined with her husband's ruthless power, creates a terrifyingly plausible narrative. Phyllis Coates's pre-dawn phone call and, most compellingly, the alleged deathbed confession overheard by Edward Lawsey, transform this from simple speculation into one of Hollywood's most coherent and chilling murder theories that we will likely never have a courtroom verdict. The key players are long gone. But the evidence, when pieced together, tells a story that is far worse than a simple suicide. It's about the absolute corruption of power. It's about a time when a studio could potentially control the police, the press, and the coroner. George Reeves wasn't killed by kryptonite. He was killed by the dark, toxic side of Hollywood itself, an industry that created the myth of Superman, and then, perhaps, murdered the man who played him. The secrets of old Hollywood are buried deep. What are your thoughts on the George Reeves case? Do you believe the deathbed confession? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more dark Hollywood mysteries, be sure to subscribe and check out our other videos. Thanks for watching.